How many districts are familiar with the ultra thin? District 4? Who's here from 4? Over there? I know you guys got a job out in 81. Not looking too pretty though, from what I've seen. So hopefully some of this talk I can give you here maybe can educate you on maybe some issues that you're having up there. But we've been doing ultra thin since it was introduced. My dad actually introduced it back in the 90s. It was a patented French paving process back in the day. You know, the patent has since expired, so it's not proprietary anymore. The way I like to describe ultra thin is it's basically a paver-placed chip seal. So you see in this room, we're all emulsion-based people, we're pavement preservation people. You know, this process is truly a marriage between the cold, the emulsion side, and then the hot mix side. You know, I'd say the reason we're talking about it here and we don't talk about it at PAAMA likes thick hot mix layers. They want to see you guys use tons of hot mix. Ultra thin, you're just using a thin treatment. It's still a preservation treatment. So we'll go through this presentation just explaining what the treatment is, the equipment that's used to place it, because there is some special equipment, high quality materials. You'll hear me talk a lot about high quality materials. It takes high quality materials to make this product successful. The key with all the treatments that PAAMA applies is when and where to install it. You know, that's always the secret ingredient. I think that's why you guys are all in this room today, and ladies, is to learn when, you know, what treatment should I use, where should I use it, and when in the pavement's life should I use it. Then we'll talk about some mix design considerations and prep work. And of course, why you want to use it. So ultra thin, like I said, it's a combination of, it's like doing a chip seal and a 3/4 inch gap graded hot mix overlay all into one treatment. You're using a polymer modified emulsion similar to a chip seal emulsion. It's got a similar residue, slightly lower than a CRS2P, but you get a good sealing of the road to waterproof that road prior to putting a thin overlay on top. But it is a hot mix system, you know, so you get the benefits of a chip seal, you get the sealing qualities of a chip seal, which we all want, but you heard about some of the negatives with a chip seal, you know, the public perception, doesn't level the roads. You know, so this treatment marries those two treatments into one. You get the benefits of the chip seal, the sealing qualities to waterproof that road, but then you get the benefits of the hot mix, the leveling abilities. So the traveling public thinks, oh wow, they paved my road, paved my street, you know, but little do they know it's just a real thin maintenance overlay. It does take specialized equipment to make this treatment work. You know, it takes a spray paver. There's a few different versions out there. The picture you see here is a Vogel spray paver, but basically it's like an asphalt distributor and a paver combined into one machine. You know, so the tank holds about 500 to 1,000 gallons of liquid, and then you're receiving the hot mix similar like you would to a regular conventional paver. The important thing is that the emulsion's not disturbed, so you don't have the dump trucks driving in your tack, you don't have the paver driving in your tack. You know, every square inch of that road is sealed with the polymer liquid prior to that hot mix being placed on top. And that's happening just within a few seconds. Now we'll talk about the materials. We'll start with the asphalt emulsion. It is a special emulsion specific just for this treatment. You know, it's very similar to a chip seal emulsion, but it does have a lower viscosity because you're spraying a lower application rate. You know, so typical application rates with ultra thin, you know, on a smooth surface with high traffic, it may be as low as 0.15. Hey, it's a very open surface, low volume. You might be as high as a 1/4 gallon of emulsion per square yard. You know, so you're, you know, not quite as much of a chip seal, but you're definitely, you know, a lot more than just a tack coat for an overlay. It has a higher elastic recovery than a CRS2P, so it has more latex, has more polymer in there to glue that thin hot mix to the surface. With this treatment, there's an interaction of the two materials. You know, so you're spraying an asphalt emulsion in the water phase, you know, around 170 degrees, and then within a few seconds, you're putting a hot mix on top of it. The hot mix is typically 315, 320. It's above the boiling point of water. So what happens is the heat of that hot mix draws that soft polymer emulsion up into the voids of the ultra thin. And that's what gives you that impervious layer. So the bottom 3/8 of ultra thin is totally impervious. It's totally waterproof. But if you see in that picture of the mix, the structure, it's like a mini SMA. So it's the same design concepts as a stone matrix asphalt that everybody's familiar with. You get that interlocking of the cubical rock. So the top layer is open graded. You need those voids. That's where the soft emulsion can go up into. This wouldn't work necessarily with a dense hot mix, as there's you don't have as many air voids, so there's increased risk of bleeding with a dense hot mix. That's why you typically see spray pavers used for open graded mixes. Now we'll talk about the hot mix material itself. It starts with a high quality, single size, cubical, durable, coarse aggregate. So basically the blend of the mix, it's typically a 2 aggregate blend. You're typically 70% of a single size cubical 3/8 inch aggregate, and then about 30% of a B3 screenings, kind of a fine graded B3 screenings. And that's what creates the gap grade in the mix. So it's not open grade like open graded friction coarse that's used in southern part of the country. It's truly like an SMA. It's a cubical single size rock, and then you have all the fines to hold that thick film of asphalt binder onto the mix itself. The binder is the same as hot mix. You use 64S minus 22. I'd say that's used on all municipal projects. You can use a polymer modified binder, for certain scenarios. I would argue that maybe as designers, you're specifying the polymer modified binder in scenarios where you don't really need it, and just kind of add into the cost of the treatment unnecessarily. You guys with the polymer plants, I'm sorry, but it's the truth. Because you're getting the polymer modification from the emulsion you're applying on the road. So you're applying an emulsion that is heavily polymerized, and then that hot mix is drawing that soft polymer up into the mix and locking that thin hot mix down. So I would say scenarios where you would want to use polymer modified binder could be, severe, if you're on an interstate and you're doing ramps, maybe areas that have severe stress, things like that. But I'd say 90% of roads you wouldn't need polymer. It's a gap graded material. It's basically it's a mini SMA. So if you think of the same design concepts as an SMA, this is just a mini version of it. One difference is, I know with a lot of SMA specs, you guys will use fiber to help hold that asphalt film onto the aggregate at the hot mix plant. With ultra thin, that's not necessary as long as you design the mix correctly. So typically with ultra thin, you'll pass into 200, your true dust in the mix. You're usually targeting a similar percentage of AC. So if your mix has 5% AC, you might have 5% of dust. And that dust helps hold that thick film asphalt on the mix. The mix delivery temp is critical. You talk about warm mix. We can't use warm mix technology with this treatment. I mean, you can use the additives, but we can't reduce the temperature, because to make this treatment work, you need the interaction of the two materials. So you need that hot mix at an elevated temperature that's above the boiling point of water that's going to drive that emulsion to cure. And the voids in that mix, there's almost like a foaming action that happens right when the two materials hit each other. That emulsion, it's foamed up into the mix. The steam that's generated, that comes out through the air void. So, using that gap graded mix, you don't have to worry, the emulsion's not broke, I'm gonna trap water under my pavement. That won't happen, it can escape through the voids. And it's a cooling action that happens. So when that steam that's generated from the emulsion setting comes up through the mix, it cools the mix rapidly. We can return it to traffic. Car had to cross it even before it's rolled, you could get a car across it immediately. Now we'll talk about project selection, when and where you want to use the treatment. This is the graph we all kind of live and die by for pavement preservation. It's like, hey, picking the right treatment for the right road with the right pavement condition. Of course, in the upper parts of that graph is your single seals, your single micros. cape seals as you get further down, and the ultra thin is in that mid area. You know, I would say typically the ultra thin you're doing in those B and C condition of roads. You wouldn't want to use it when the condition of the road is poor. You know, once it gets to the poor condition, hey, then that's you're getting close to the mill and pave type scenarios. Here's some pictures of pavement conditions. You know, I would call those B pavement conditions. So if you place, you know, I'd say you're relatively early if you're placing ultra thin on these type of roads, but you know, that's why I always give a range in lifespan. So you place ultra thin on a road that's in this condition, you'll get 15 plus years of life out of that treatment. And the benefit of ultra thin is the only future maintenance treatment is seal any cracks that would reflect through. You know, no matter what the treatment is, hey, cracks are going to reflect through. Ultra thin's no different. It's not a miracle cure. Working cracks are going to come back through. You know, typically 3, 4, 5 years later, you'll get out there and you'll rubberize seal whatever cracks do reflect through. That's truly only maintenance you need to do in that time frame. And you get to the C conditions of roadways. Hey, more cracking, more fatigue cracks, block cracking, and then you get the concrete. You know, ultra thin is unique in the fact that it will bond to concrete. So we can do asphalt or concrete roadways as long as they're structurally sound. And if anybody has any questions as we go through, don't be afraid to stop me. But another thing that's unique with ultra thin, I'd say the only other pavement treatment that you can use on any traffic counter road would be microsurfacing. So ultra thin is similar to micro in the fact that any ADT, you know, from a cul-de-sac road to an interstate, you know, you can successfully use a treatment on any of those type of roads. It has to be structurally sound, you know, so if there's areas that are alligator cracked or there's base failure, you'd have to repair those first. Question?
Relating to the concrete, that previous slide, you showed the polished concrete there. And I had asked yesterday, I just want to verify, if we would go in and we don't have so much of the slap movement, but we have corner cracking, longitudinal failures, you know, where your spalls are and so on. We went in and we did mastic on that first and then put this product down. Get some life expectancy, get 3 to 5 years, you think, on something like that? Obviously, we're not standing looking at it together.
Right,
But
yeah.
Just a thought. Am I in the ballpark or no?
I mean, 3 to 5 years is a low range, you know, but I got some examples of some projects we did where, hey, maybe it was a Band-Aid type solution. So that's the nice thing is any of the pavement preservation treatments we do, it's expectation. So, hey, if you're looking for a Band-Aid, if you're looking something as, you know, to buy you some time, you know, you're thinking right, you know, fix some spalls, seal the joints, use mastic to fill them, you know, so yeah, 3 to 5 years on that type of scenario. But hey, we'd like to see it, you know, see it and evaluate it with you just to make sure there's not any other issues there.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
We chatted yesterday about using microsurfacing and talking about the bond, especially if you've got a polished concrete. Your ultra thin is going to have a better bond because of the way the tack and the fiber tack and that works. Generally.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
It's going to give you a better shot.
Yeah, you got a superior bonding product. You know, we'll bond to whatever you put it to, as long as whatever you put it to is solid and isn't coming off. You know, if you do a concrete road, you go across the corner spall and it's truly spalled out and loose. If you don't fix that ahead of time, when that spall finally does pop in the winter, hey, the ultra thin's just real thin. It's going to come with. You know, so you want to repair the pavement first if you want long-term performance. You know, if you're looking for a Band-Aid, hey, you do a Band-Aid approach, but for the most part, hey, structurally sound roads is what you're looking to treat. You're looking to treat roads that are out of profile. So that's the differentiator with ultra thin from some other pavement preservation treatments is this process will level. You know, it's a paving screed. It's going to take out dips. It's going to level ruts. It's going to fill those areas. You know, minor. You know, if you have major dips and major issues where you have to fill 1.5 to 2 inches, you're going to have to fix those ahead of time. But minor issues, the ultra thin will take care of. Here's some examples of projects we did in District 5. You know, this is on I-78. So here's two good examples, two examples of how the district used the treatment. You know, I don't want to say right or wrong. Everybody has their own scenarios for their roads, but you can use the treatments as you see fit. But the picture there that we did, the Ultra Thin 2, we did a stretch on I-78 from going eastbound from 309 split in Coopersburg, heading east towards New Jersey, towards Hellertown. So that job there was old concrete roadway. They did some concrete repairs, did some spall repair, sealed the joints, used the Ultra Thin as the sealing and leveling course, and then put a structural overlay on top. They did a 2-inch SMA. So I'd say for the condition of that road, that was a good solution. You know, that's a long-term fix. You know, they fixed the concrete first, used the Ultra Thin to do what it does best, which is seal and level and bond the concrete. And then the SMA had a nice level surface to be placed on. You know, that stretch turned out really nice. The other stretch is more, I'd say this was the Band-Aid area, was the Ultra Thin placed on 78, which goes from 309 split, like in South Whitehall Township, heading west towards Route 100. You know, so there, hey, the concrete was in rough shape. You know, there were wide joints, there were spalls. You know, is definitely, you know, it would have been a better solution if they had the funds to put the 2-inch SMA over top of that. But you can use Ultra Thin as that Band-Aid as well. It does work. Here's some other places you can use Ultra Thin. You know, 2-lane state roads, you know, just showing signs of oxidation. I mean, you might think, oh my gosh, why would I pave a road like that? But if you get on a treatment program where you're looking at these type of conditions of roads and you get ahead of the curve, hey, that Ultra Thin 15 years, you're not going to be back on that road. You're not going to have to touch it. Actually, if you recognize this picture, there's right here where we're at is the office building there for Air Products. So that's a candidate for Ultra Thin that Upper Macungie Township's going to be looking at next year. You know, if we just talk about roads in this area, hey, we all drove in 222 coming from 78. This stretch of 222 would be a prime candidate for an Ultra Thin. Some design considerations. You know, this was a project here. We did this one in District 5. This was on Airport Road. So that was an old concrete road that had Ultra Thin on it before. You know, I don't know how old that Ultra Thin was, maybe 25 plus years old. Milled off the Ultra Thin, the old Ultra Thin, and then they were to fix the concrete joints, fix the spalls. You know, of course, there's never enough money. So, hey, they decided to put a leveling course down over the concrete, then the Ultra Thin. You know, I'm not really a fan of that approach because the negative is, hey, if that leveling course lets go on the concrete, the Ultra Thin's going to come with it. You know, so you're better off to use the Ultra Thin on top of the concrete when you can. You know, you'll get a longer lasting product. With the Ultra Thin, there's basically 3 mixes to choose from. You know, there's a gradation A, a gradation B, and a gradation C. The A is truly, that's a 1/4-inch nominal size mixture, truly just for development setting. So no PennDOT roads would ever get a gradation A. You know, it's truly for development setting. It's still a gap graded mix. It's just those gaps are smaller. You know, it's more a tighter mix, but it's still gap graded. The negative with the 1/4-inch is it is more susceptible to reflective cracking. So you think of that 1/4-inch stone, if the road in the winter moves 3/8 of an inch, that 1/4-inch rock is going to break out of that crack. So we typically don't recommend the gradation A unless you have a very, very good condition road with minimal cracking. The gradation B is what you use. 95% of projects are the gradation B. That's the 3/8-inch mix. You know, that's most similar to your SMA mixes, you know, that type of gradation. But suitable for any traffic count. You know, typical yield for Ultra Thin, you know, I kind of disagree with the PennDOT spec as written. The yield is always higher. You know, there's unrealistic application rate range in the PennDOT spec. So, but as a contractor that does it all the time, you kind of learn that, and you know, and every road's going to be different. But typical range, you're about 85 to 100 pounds per square yard for the hot mix portion with the gradation B. Ultra Thin, it's open graded, gap graded, so typically you get about 100 pounds per square yard per inch. You know, so you're a heavy 3/4 of an inch with the gradation B, depending on the road. Gradation C, PennDOT has spec'd out on some projects. There's sometimes it's availability of materials. I'm not really a fan of the C in Pennsylvania, because what the gradation C allows is it allows somebody who may not be familiar with, and I think some of this problem is what you have in District 4, is they're taking an aggregate that really wasn't crushed and screened and sized to make that mix. You're taking a blend of 67s and 8s and trying to make a mix meet a design, and yeah, it might meet the upper limit, might meet the lower limit, but it's not designed down the middle of the spec, and then that's when you run into failure. So I really don't recommend using the C. The C's and the B's do overlap, so we actually have a mix it's a course B that it also meets the C. So there is some overlap there. The problem with the C is when a hot mix producer who maybe not be familiar with it says, oh, I got this rock and I got that rock, I'll blend the two together and make a mix. But just because it meets spec doesn't mean it's going to work. Design and prep work is critical. Just with any of our pavement preservation treatments, we're only as good as what we're placed on. So I'd say base repairs, you're going to want to mill and patch areas. If you have alligatored areas, patch them with 19, bring the 19 up flush. The ultra thin will seal and act as the wearing course. Crack sealing's critical. We prefer when you're sealing cracks, and you just got to seal working cracks. It's similar to a chip seal. With a chip seal, Ben, you were saying you only have to seal cracks that are larger than 1/4 inch. Ultra thin's the same way. The fine cracks will be sealed by the emulsion you're applying, but true working cracks you need to seal. We recommend sealing them with a dish, just extrude it on a dish, not squeegeed like you would for hot mix overlay, for a dense hot mix overlay, or for microsurfacing. The benefit of extruding it with a dish and putting a little more rubberized crack seal there is, since our material is gap graded, we put that hot mix down on top of that crack seal. Some of that soft, flexible crack seals pulled up into the mix, and it actually makes the ultra thin more flexible. We made a plug in the lab over top of some crack seal, and you could bend the ultra thin in a U and it wouldn't break when you allow that crack seal to come up through. So that is something that's very important. Can't argue that enough, especially on concrete roads. You want to do proper joint sealing. Hot pour mastic is a good solution for wide cracks, where the wide concrete joints, any crack or joint wider than 3/4, the hot pour mastic is a solution. Spot chip seal, you can use spot chip seal. Ernie, you were talking about fiber mat as an inner layer. We kind of do same type of inner layer. Hey, you could use fiber mat as that inner layer before ultra thin, or you could use a chip seal. A chip seal, we do some work down in North Carolina. They call it a mat coat. So hey, before they do their overlays, if they have a road that they know is cracked, hey, they'll mill it off and they'll do a mat coat. They'll chip seal it with a 67 size stone, and then they'll put the hot mix on top of it. You could do the same thing here, but since we're a thin mix, we would just chip it with a normal number 8. And you kind of spot chip seal areas that are a little too far gone to crack seal. Kind of like that slide Rex had there for the scrub seal, those alligatored areas. It's not to the point where it needs base repair, but it's to the point where crack seal is not the right tool. So just pick the right tool for the right scenario. So combination treatments in our industry, using 3 minor inexpensive prep treatments makes the ultra thin that much better. So you got to keep that in mind with all the treatments that our organization represents. When you add to the treatments, you only make them better. Here's that stretch of road we did on I-78. And these are real pictures. I was out there, took that picture of the existing conditions. So, hey, if you drive that road now and you see, hey, those joints are re-cracked. That 5-inch wide joint is open back up. Some of those spalls that weren't repaired, that middle picture, that one makes me nuts because that was never fixed. But now I can see that same square sitting there. So prep work's important. Ultra thin will work on concrete roads. It works very well, but just fix those minor problems, and it's going to perform. But hey, any slabs that are moving, take them out, do spall repairs, seal the joints. That wide joint there with the shoulder, the shoulder was actually separating from the roadway. There, I don't even know that you could, that's beyond mastic. You got to fix that concrete with some other material first. Picture on that same stretch of road just to show that you know, the concrete shoulders we did not do. Hey, but the joints, when they sealed the joints, they just sealed them with a tip. You know, they just filled them with a tip. You know, the sealant was, you know, 3/8 of an inch below flush with the concrete. If they would have sealed this concrete with the right, you know, same way, rubberized sealer, but instead of the cleaning and sealing spec, just blow and seal, but then do an overband and get a little more mass of sealant on that and give the ultra thin a chance. You know, that soft sealant comes up in those joints, you won't see those reflective cracks. Eventually you will. I mean, if there's severe movement, they're going to come back, but you won't have any delamination at that joint because now you made the ultra thin more flexible at the joint. Benefits of the treatment, why you want to use it. Biggest benefit is the sealing qualities. You got the sealing qualities of a chip seal. Chip seal is still the best treatment cost-wise per square yard that you can do on a road. The problem is you don't want a chip sealed surface. So, hey, that's when the combination treatments come into play. I'd say ultra thin is like a combination treatment, but it's in one treatment. It's one system, one step. It's the cleanest, neatest treatment, preservation treatment system there is. You know, so it's going to seal like a chip seal, and you're going to get the benefits of a hot mix. It's going to level like a hot mix. The only difference with our material, since we're using a single size cubicle durable mix, 100% virgin, no wrap in the mix, we're going to outperform hot mix. Our system is going to last 15 years. You're not going to have to put a surface seal on an ultra thin road. The only thing you're going to have to do is seal any cracks that reflect through. But public perception, you know, it's one of the most publicly accepted treatments there is. Saves on curb reveal, so typically you don't have to do any milling with ultra thin. Matter of fact, there's some states that will full profile mill before placing ultra thin. I'm not a big fan of that because sometimes if you try to profile mill, hey, they mill too deep, or you know, if the last overlay was 1.5 inches and they mill 3/4, hey, now you're relying on that bond from the last hot mix overlay that was done that you're not gonna mill too far through and have some delamination. So if the ruts are severe, then maybe it's not the right treatment. You know, this would be for ruts that are more, you know, 3/4 to 1 inch deep ruts, you know, no more than that. But the gap graded mix gives you increased skid resistance, and that virgin mix is, I mean, ultra thin, you'll see it keeps a black rich color for 2 to 3 years later. Here's some more benefits. Hey, it saves natural resources. You know, we're probably the most green industry, you know, there is. You know, the products that PAAMA represents, as long as you use them at the right time and on the right road, hey, you want to, it takes a high quality rock, and sometimes we'll haul that quality rock further, but by doing that, you're at the end of the day, you're going to consume less energy because you don't need a thick overlay. You just need a thin treatment. Here's just some pictures of some typical jobs, you know, from a through road, a residential setting to a cul-de-sac road. Horse and buggies, you know, we do a lot of work in Lancaster County. Picture on the left is in East Earl Township, heavily traveled horse and buggy road. We did that, you know, 4 years ago. So you can see, oh, hey, ultra thin, it will wear. You know, nothing's going to stop the wear with horse and buggies. But since we're using such a hard, durable rock, it's going to wear a lot slower than, you know, limestone will in Lancaster County. You know, so we use a real hard, durable stone. The picture on the right is a road we're going to do this year. It's the same stretch of road on that same road, but you can see how, you know, the ruts are close to 1.5 inches, you know, but the ultra thin, that's a sound road. It's just the horse has got it wore. So that's a good solution for that road. It's the ultra thin. But minor arterial to major arterial roads. Picture on the right was Maryland. Picture on the left is by, that's Airport Road by Lehigh Valley Airport. But you can use it on freeways and interstates. You know, you can cover a lot of miles in a night, you know, since you're doing a thin treatment. That's it. Anybody have any questions?
What would be your minimum and maximum ambient temperature you want to put this on?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we actually got a call, you know, we do ultra thin, hey, districts 4, 5, 6, and 8. we got a call from one of our good customers. He was going hunting in November. He's like, I just seen a spray paver on I-81 in November. He says, what are they doing? You know, it's like, you know, ultra thin, hey, in the spec, the district executive can tell the contractor he can continue on, but ultra thin's like a chip seal. So it's not even the temperature the day you do it, it's what's the temperature 2 weeks later. You know, most of the water's driven off in, you know, from the hot mix initially right away, but not all of it. You know, so you still have water under there if it freezes, you know, a week after you do it. You know, the PennDOT spec, you know, you can go to October 31st. You know, that's pushing it. Typically, if it was my money, I you know, you can still successfully do work in October, but you got to pick your days. You know, you're 50 and rising, you know, is the spec. You know, but come mid-October, you're definitely not nights. You know, you're definitely days. You know, but anything from mid-October to the end of October, it's like chip sealing late season. If you chip seal in September, what happens? If you're only doing a single, the chip seal's raveling off. The same thing up there. You know, you got areas that are raveling, but when I went up there and looked at the mix, it's not even a well-designed mix. They're trying to lay it too thin. So what they're doing is they're looking at the PennDOT spec that gives that application rate range, but what they didn't look in the spec that says there's a paragraph underneath that says, hey, you still have to lay a nice uniform mat. So if it's scraping down the road, that should be milled and removed and replaced. I mean, that's, you know, that's not what the product is. That's not how it should perform, you know, so it gives the product a bad name. Go ahead. Like in Lancaster County, hey, when they get close to an inch and beyond, the problem is the horses will break through the overlay over top. So once it breaks through and it looks like it's loose, then you have to fix that ahead of time. But as long as it didn't break through and it's structurally sound, you know, it'll fill those ruts. I mean, yeah, I'm not afraid of filling, you know, inch and a half, but, you know. Yeah, no, there was good ruts as long as it's structurally sound, you know. But if the rutting is because of the subgrade, you know, which Mike's going to talk about soon, but if the rutting is with the subgrade, then it's not the right treatment because the problem's deeper, you know. If it's truly, yeah. Ultra thin, it's like an SMA, it's rut resistant. You know, it's going to be a rut resistant mix, but hey, if the deformation's happening underneath, then hey, it's going to reflect through. Anybody else?
I got a question for you, Terry.
Okay.
Let me get up here. So we're having a discussion. So is the ultra thin like an OGFC where it's taking water in and then channeling it, or not?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's not because the bottom layer, so the bottom half inch of the ultra thin is totally impervious. So you got a waterproofing membrane put down there because that emulsion fills those bottom voids. If you ever take a core sample ultra thin, the bottom is totally dense, totally filled with a soft, flexible emulsion, and then just your top half inch is open graded. If you get a mild rain, hey, the water will channel, it'll go down to the emulsion barrier, and then it'll flow out the sides, but it's not like open graded friction course, which is truly porous and open, but that's why open graded friction course will ravel.
And that was my question. If they need to come back on a job that you've done and do something on the shoulder, a chip seal, a micro, can we overlap, or do we not want to overlap that ultra thin?
You won't really trap any water. I mean, you
Okay.
really won't. I mean, it'll sheet off till it gets to that point, and it'll go up and over. But it's, yeah, really not.
Because that'll ruin an OGFC. I didn't know.
Right.
Yeah.
With the difference is just our stone, it's cubical, it's interlocked, and it's not as open as an open graded friction course. It's got more fines on the bottom end. It's more like an SMA.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions?
Over here.
Oh,
With base repair preparation ahead of this, would you be concerned if you're using 19 millimeter versus the existing surface of a 9.5? Would that be absorbing more oil and not necessarily get your adhered?
Yeah, 19's fine. I wouldn't do 25. You know, once you get to 25, that's too open, just like a chip seal. Hey, it's going to soak that emulsion in. Sometimes if you had a real open patch, what we would do is we would pre-treat that area ahead of time. Hey, we might hand spray that area before the spray paver gets to it, and we've already done that, or fog seal it. We've done that. You know, so prep work wise, it's like if you can do it the season before and it has a chance to densify is always best. If it's a fresh patch, you know, then yeah, maybe you want to pre-treat those areas pre-treat those areas first. One other thing I want to bring up is just related to bids with ultra thin. Hey, it is a special material. It's not designed for all cases. I mean, hey, we still need hot mix. We still got to have milled and paved roads. This just fills the gap. Before an overlay is needed, but maybe it's too far gone for a chip seal or a cape seal or a micro, or maybe it's a public perception area. Hey, I know in this area of the county, I get all kinds of complaints when they do this treatment. With this one, you won't, but it's not a cure-all. It's not going to replace hot mix by any stretch of the imagination.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks.
Appreciate it.
Yep.